All right, well, welcome. While we're waiting for this to get working, I saw another employee of the college this morning on campus. He was asking me about when I was going to give the lecture, and I told him, and he said, "Oh yeah, I remember you got that really weird title." So I really appreciated that vote of confidence. And at this point, I wish I could say it's not my fault. The topic was suggested to me. And in fact, that's exactly what I thought until last week when I asked our department chair, Professor Hamilton, what exactly he wanted from this lecture, because he told me that this is what I should do. And he said, "We never had that conversation." So apparently my subconscious wanted to create the idea that I didn't come up with this topic on my own, but I have to say I guess I did. So I was trying to think, is there any way to make this practical? And the short answer is no, but I'm going to try. I'm going to try to do that by looking at Hebrews chapter 3, verses 1 through 4. I want to do this at the very beginning and set the stage for why I think this actually could be a practical lesson. Notice I said could be. Hebrews chapter 3. The writer of Hebrews is, of course, making these comparisons. He's making these comparisons between the prophets, between the angels, and then by the time we get to chapter 3, between Moses and Jesus. And several years ago, I remember a preacher telling me that the comparisons work better when we realize that the author is not saying, look how great Jesus is, and compared to these figures who, well, they weren't that great. The comparison works better when we realize just how great they were. And that's really the objective of this lesson. Just how great was Moses when he is compared to Jesus in Hebrews chapter 3, beginning of verse 1. Therefore, holy brothers, you who share in a heavenly calling, consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession, who is faithful to him who appointed him, just as Moses also was faithful in all God's house. For Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses, as much more glory as the builder of a house has more honor than the house itself, for every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. So verse 3 suggests that Moses has some glory, that Moses is indeed worthy of honor, and Moses is great. And so again, this lecture is about just how much glory did he have in the eyes of the contemporaries of Jesus and the contemporaries of the author of Hebrews. So what we're talking specifically about then is Moses and his depiction in Second Temple period literature. And first, I want to correct some terminology. I say correct, excuse me. I don't mean to say the terminology I prefer is better than this other necessary. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying for what we're doing, I prefer it. Okay, that's all I'm saying. So, what are we talking about when we talk about the Second Temple period? Well, sometimes this is referred to as the 400 years of silence, and I completely understand why it's called that, and in certain contexts, I could not disagree. But in this particular context, I think it's less than helpful, and let me tell you why, and I can only tell you why from my personal experience. I remember when I first started studying, when I first started studying the Bible seriously, I was shocked, and I mean that word specifically, shocked to find that there were Jewish writings produced after the Old Testament and before the New Testament. Maybe that's just my own naivete at that particular point. But I had no idea there were all these texts. And some of them, quite frankly, are worth reading. Maybe they're not, or well, not maybe, but they may not be in our canon of Old Testament Scripture, but they're still worth reading. At any rate, I think 400 Years of Silence hides that fact and can mislead someone to thinking, well, the only Jewish writings are the Old Testament and then, of course, the New Testament. Another problematic way to describe this is the intertestamental period, and I think this is especially misleading because this suggests there's a break between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, and that's just simply inaccurate. And it can make passages in the New Testament where specifically Jesus appeals to the Mosaic Law and the Old Covenant, make it very confusing if you think there's some sort of break. So I don't really like that either. So again, I prefer the Second Temple period literature, which covers the period from 515 BC to AD 70, when the Romans destroyed the Second Temple. I think this is less misleading and more helpful, especially when we're doing what we are in this particular lecture. So let's talk about some of that literature then of the Second Temple period. Obviously, for a lack of time, we can't talk about any of these writings really in detail. But let's just get a sense of the vastness of these texts. First of all, we have the Apocrypha. These are texts that if you were to go out and buy a Catholic Bible, these texts are going to be in there. So they are in the Catholic canon, although they are not in the Jewish canon and therefore not in the Protestant canon. But these books include things like 1st and 2nd Maccabees. 1st Maccabees in particular is a quite good historical source and probably a source of Josephus later on. It's, in my opinion, definitely worth reading. Ben Sira is also influential. You've got this curious little book, Tobit, that, in my opinion, is also worth reading. It's about this guy living in Nineveh. At any rate, you've got Jubilees, which is a retelling of Genesis and a little bit of Exodus. And then finally, you have 4th Ezra, which is an apocalyptic text. It's basically if you have apocalyptic text and Job mixed together. And I would say out of all of them, in my opinion, that one is the one to read. Then you have the Pseudepigrapha. And this category is debated among scholars. And that's because it's almost like a catch-all. And what's a part of the Pseudepigrapha and what's not, again, this debate probably doesn't concern us at all, but it's difficult to know where this category begins and where it ends. This includes texts like 1st Enoch. Those of you who are careful readers of the New Testament, you already know how important this text is because it's explicitly quoted. It's quoted in the book of Jude, and it's alluded to, I think, a few other times. It's worth reading. It's not that interesting, in my opinion, but it's definitely worth reading at least once. Then you have 2nd Baruch, which is dated to the late 1st century AD. It's also an apocalyptic text. The letter of Aristeas, which gives us a quasi-historical narrative of the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And then you have the Sibylline Oracles, which is a bit strange. Anyway, you have the Hellenistic writers, and that's what we're interested in mostly today. Philo of Alexandria, Josephus, who's, I would say, is definitely the most well-known of this group. He's the 1st century historian, and Josephus' contribution is immensely important. In fact, what would we know about Judaism and Jewish history in the 1st century without Josephus? Not very much. So he's extremely important. And then we have minor Hellenistic authors. Some of those we will meet in just a minute. And then we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered the late 1940s, and everybody was so excited, mainly because of the age of the biblical text that they discovered. It's tremendous. But there were also some texts that were brand new. No one had ever seen them before, like the Community Rule, like the War Scroll, and part of the Damascus document, although that one is a little bit different because a scholar had already found a copy of it and published it in the late 1800s. So we had most of the Damascus document, but not all of it. At any rate, we won't really be talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls today, but it's worth knowing something about them. Okay? So, what can we say about the Exodus event in the Second Temple period literature? And by the way, I'm glad that so far we're 11 minutes in, 10 minutes in. There hasn't been a mass exodus from this place based upon the lecture so far. I'm really glad about that. So if you're thinking about leaving, well, no pressure. Okay, so what can we say generally about the Exodus event and how it's been received in this Second Temple literature? Well, the Exodus, because you had this relationship used loosely, between Israel and another nation, that is Egypt, it was a pretty good basis for later Jews to reflect upon their own relationship with their non-Jewish neighbors. And so guess what? Moses becomes an extremely important figure. And his credentials and achievements in the Bible are pretty amazing. And of course, we've heard about that this week already. We will continue to hear about all the things Moses did again, which are extremely impressive. But they're nothing compared to the way he is depicted in the sources that we're going to look at. Okay, so that's really, I think, the main takeaway from how it's generally received in the Second Temple period literature. Let's begin with an author that I would assume most of us probably don't know much about. And I recall a few years ago, I had a member at the congregation where we were at, and he was very interested in trying to learn more about these non-biblical Jewish writings. And he said, I've read through Josephus, and it was okay, but I picked up this Philo guy and totally lost. And that's a pretty good way to describe him. It's very, very difficult to pick him up and read, and probably, I would say mainly, because of this last point that I have up here. You need to know something about the Greek Pentateuch specifically. He quotes from other books in the Old Testament, but very rarely. Mostly it's the Greek Pentateuch. You also have to know something about Platonic cosmology. In other words, the way that Plato saw the universe and how it works. That's how Philo looked at it as well. But he also had notions of Stoic ethics. So if you don't know anything about Stoicism, you don't know anything about Platonism, and you know something about the Bible, good luck with Philo. It's going to be really difficult going. At any rate, his dates are 20 BC to 40 AD, so he's roughly a contemporary with Jesus and Paul as well. There's no indication, by the way, that Philo ever came into contact with Jesus or Paul. There is a question among New Testament scholars as to whether Paul knew some of Philo's writings. And as far as I know, maybe others can correct me, but as far as I know, there's no agreement about that. Okay, but at any rate, very well educated. Professor Saltz and I have had the opportunity to be in a Philo class where we read it in Greek, and it's eye-opening because you learn New Testament Greek, you think you're doing very well, and then you get to Philo and you think, do I even really know Greek anymore? And that says something about his level of education. He wrote a lot, and fortunately for us, we have quite a bit of his writings. Okay, enough introduction. Let's see what he has to say about the greatness of Moses. We're fortunate in the works that we have from Philo that we have this work entitled The Life of Moses. And you might expect him to basically retell the biblical story. That's not what he does. Okay, he does retell some of the events. But what he says about Moses is often very much exaggerated, but it gives us a good impression of at least what Philo thought. He says, I've conceived the idea of writing the life of Moses, who according to the account of some persons was the lawgiver of the Jews, but according to others only an interpreter of the sacred laws. The greatest and most perfect man that ever lived, having a desire to make his character fully known to those who ought not to remain in ignorance respecting him. For the glory of the laws which he left behind him has reached over the whole world, has penetrated the very furthest limits of the universe, and those who do really and truly understand him are not many. Perhaps partly out of envy, or else from the disposition so common to many persons of resisting the commands which are delivered by lawgivers in different states. So first of all, he notes his role as lawgiver, which was a big deal in Greek culture. In fact, Josephus, in his apologetic work, mentions Moses as the lawgiver and places great emphasis upon that. He mentions that first, but that's not the greatest thing about Moses. He's the greatest and most perfect man to ever have lived. We could just stop there, and that might give us an impression. But we have to be careful methodologically, though. And I want to be clear about this. Just because Philo says something about Moses doesn't mean that all Jews or most Jews at the time of Jesus, at the time that the writer of Hebrews produced his work, would have agreed. We simply cannot know that. Why? Because we can't get in a time machine and we can't go back to first century Israel and the diaspora and ask Jews, hey, what do you think about Moses? Impossible. We can't do it. But what I want to do in this lecture, beginning with Philo, is to look at how all these authors are building the case for the greatness of Moses, thus suggesting the high probability, I think, that the author of Hebrews would have known about this tradition, and so would have his readers. That's all I'm doing. Okay, so I want to make that very, very clear. Okay, so this is what Philo says about Moses. But he continues on. In the next part of the text, he goes over his childhood, which, if you recall, in the Exodus narrative, we have very few details. At this point, though, in Philo's work, he says he wasn't like other kids. He wasn't worried about playing with toys and such frivolous activities. He was worried about building his character and being able to deny himself of the passions. There's that Stoic ethic again. He denied himself the passions and therefore made himself this great character that he already said he was. All right, so he says, very naturally, therefore, those who associated with Moses and everyone who was acquainted with him marveled at him, being astonished as at a novel spectacle and inquiring what kind of mind it was that had its abode in his body and that was set up in it like an image in a shrine, whether it was a human mind or a divine intellect or something combined of the two. Because he had nothing in him resembling the many, but had gone beyond them all and was elevated to a more sublime height. Now, we might read this and we might say, is he saying that Moses is in some sense divine? I wouldn't quite say that. We see writers like Philo using this language of being somewhat divine and somewhat human. We shouldn't automatically jump to the idea, okay, Philo thought Moses was a god or something like that. That's not what he's saying. But on the other hand, he does seem to be saying he's above most human beings in whatever sense we might take that. And ultimately, I don't know exactly how to take this phrase. If that wasn't impressive enough, let's look at one more passage from Philo of Alexandria. He says, if the prophet Moses was truly called the friend of God, then it follows that he would naturally partake of God himself and of all his possessions as far as he had need. For God possesses everything and is in need of nothing. He goes on to say that even good men need something. And then he says, what more shall I say? Has he not also enjoyed an even greater communion with the Father and Creator of the universe, being thought unworthy of being called by the same appellation? For he also was called the God and King of the whole nation. He's said to have entered into the darkness where God was, that is to say, into the invisible, shapeless, and incorporeal world, the essence, which is the model of all existing things, where he beheld things invisible to mortal nature. For having brought himself and his own light into the middle as an excellently wrought picture, he established himself as a most beautiful and godlike work, to be a model for all those who are inclined to imitate him. For me, I don't know how much closer Philo could get to saying Moses partook of the divine essence somehow. That's pretty much what he's saying, I think. And there's almost a mystical language, the ascent of the soul almost. Neoplatonism picks up this language later on. He's saying Moses went there. Moses was already there. So what kind of glory did Moses have in the eyes of Philo? A tremendous amount. All right, well, let's look at a different author. And this is an author that I would assume most everyone in here has never heard of him. And that's no disrespect to you. That's because most people probably aren't as nerdy as myself that they might actually know who this guy is. But I think he's fascinating. His name is Ezekiel the Tragedian, and of course, let's not be confused by this Ezekiel with the prophet Ezekiel. These are not the same people. No one thought they were. They're separated by decades or centuries, so let's not get that confused. We only have one work from this guy, and it's preserved fragmentarily, and it's called the Exegoge. It is a drama, a tragedy in the framework of the Greek tragedians like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. He took that way of writing and said, okay, I'm going to make a biblical version of it, specifically dealing with the Exodus and more specifically dealing with Moses. And it's a tragedy, which means it doesn't have a happy ending. Tragedy and comedy in the classical world, comedy means it has a good ending. Happy ending. It doesn't mean it's funny necessarily. A tragedy means it doesn't have a good ending. But we don't know how this text ends. Again, it's preserved only fragmentarily, and very few manuscripts, in fact, preserve this text. It's only preserved, by the way, in later Christian authors. But if you read Ezekiel the Tragedian's work, you come to realize he's very educated, like Philo was, and specifically with regard to the tragedians like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, as I said. He's mainly influenced by Euripides, who was the most well-known and most popular in the Hellenistic period of the tragedians. Probably lived in the 2nd century BC in Egypt, like most of the writers that we're going to be looking at. All right, so some of the things that he relates include the burning bush, which by and large sticks pretty close to the biblical narrative. But there's one passage wherein we have nothing like it in the text. And so that's what I want to look at. So this is Moses talking about this dream that he has. And he says, there seems to be a throne on Sinai's mountain peaks, so great it reaches from the hillside up to heaven, and on it sits a noble man with diadems all crowned, with mighty scepter held in his left hand. And with the right hand to me he waved, and I was set before the throne. To me he gave the scepter, and on that great throne he said to sit. The kingly being gave to me the diadems as he himself stepped off the throne. And I was looking up at the earth, all circling around, the things of earth below, of heaven above. The multitude of stars to me upon their knees fell down, and I was counting all of them as they passed by like troops of mortal men. Then being startled, I was wakened out of sleep. Now here in a minute, we have the interpretation of the dream by the angel Raguel. But before we look at that interpretation, if we just read this text, what is this saying? Well, this text seems to be saying that Moses should become a king. And not just a king of Israel, but in some sense a cosmic king. Later Jewish sources have this explicitly. But whether or not this is what he means, we can leave to Raguel's interpretation, which I think clarifies it. But at the very least, this is impressive language. And whatever specifically it means when Moses sits on the throne, he is again in that realm with Philo. He seems to be almost something more than human being. Again, the glory of Moses is impressive. One detail here that I think is interesting, because as you could imagine, Moses is not the only biblical figure that in later literature his characteristics and his qualifications get exaggerated. Abraham is another. But look at this, 4 lines from the bottom. The multitude of stars to me upon their knees fell down, and I was counting all of them. And some have suggested that this might be a comparison with Abraham. Remember, God shows Abraham the stars, and he says, "These will be your descendants if you can count them." But Abraham never tries to count them. The impression from the text is he couldn't. But Moses can count them. I think that might be a subtle indication that we are to see that Moses is more impressive than Abraham even. Again, it doesn't say that explicitly, but I think that's a good possibility. All right, well, let's look at Raguel's interpretation of the dream. He says, "My friend, this is a good sign from God. May I live to see the day when these things are fulfilled. You will establish a great throne, become a judge and leader of men. As for your vision of the whole earth, the world below, and that above the heavens, this signifies that you will see what is, what has been, and what shall be." So what do we take from this interpretation? Because, of course, literarily, we would say that the author here is giving the vision and what he thinks it means. Because, of course, none of this ever happened. He's inventing this whole scene. So what he's saying then is, this dream means you are going to be a ruler. And it may indirectly mean that when he establishes, through the giving of the law, being the lawgiver, he's establishing the nation of Israel that will, of course, become a great kingdom, specifically at the time of Solomon. He could be saying that, but I do think he's saying more than that. It's not just that he will establish a nation that will become this great kingdom. He himself is going to be a judge and leader of human beings. That's what the text says. The other thing that it says is you are going to see the past, the present, and the future. Later interpreters picked this up and they said, well, since God inspired him to write the Pentateuch, he must have had knowledge of everything. Because, of course, he does prophesy some things. But what's ironic about this is the prophecy that he has, specifically in Deuteronomy, is about kings, but not in a positive light. So I think that's kind of an interesting counterpoint to this particular dream. So again, how great is Moses? How worthy of glory is he? Well, he's going to be basically a king, and he can see everything, past, present, and future. All right, let's look at a couple more authors. The first one is Aristobulus, 2nd century BC Egypt. We're getting used to that. His work is apologetic in nature. So we think about apologetics, obviously, with regard to Christianity. But apologetics have been around for a very long time as it pertains to the Judeo-Christian and Islamic tradition. And we see that with Aristobulus. We see it more predominantly again in Josephus against Apion. But Aristobulus is wanting to show how great the Jewish nation is in comparison specifically to Greek culture. Why? Because he is surrounded by Greeks. And in antiquity, the mantra of the older is better was predominant. In other words, if you could say that your cultural heritage was the oldest, you win the argument. And that's what a lot of these apologists, these Jewish apologists, try to do, essentially. Clement tells us that Aristobulus, was an adherent of Aristotelian philosophy, and he dedicated his work to one of the Ptolemaic kings. Okay, why do I mention that? Well, first of all, I mentioned Aristotle because I wanted to. And secondly, I say that he dedicated his work to the Ptolemaic kings. That notion might indicate this is not just some crazy I got my arms up, so there we go. I think it worked. Maybe I shouldn't raise my arms. I don't know. Maybe that has something to do with it. I don't know. But that indicates, I think, that maybe he's not just some crazy guy off to himself who never influenced anybody. If he's dedicating his work to the Ptolemaic kings, this could indicate he's an important official. And if he's an important official, people are going to listen to him. I could be wrong about that, but that makes sense to me. And so what he says could reflect what more people thought. And that's, of course, important for us when we think about what the writer of Hebrews had to say. All right, well, let's look at what he says. And I know the text here may be a little bit small, but this is what it says. It's preserved in Eusebius, this passage. It says, "It is evident that Plato closely followed our legislation." No, that didn't happen. But why would he want to argue that? Because Plato, of course, was extremely influential. And if he can say that Moses influenced Plato, he's won that battle again of the older is the better. So Plato closely followed our legislation and has carefully studied the several precepts contained in it. Now, the writer at this point realizes he's got a chronological problem, or a language problem. And that is, you have to argue at this point that Plato knew Hebrew. And of course, the author is not willing to argue that point. But the problem is, traditionally, the Septuagint translation didn't happen until about the 3rd century BC. And that seems to be what he presupposes. So therefore, he says, others before Demetrius Phalereus and prior to the supremacy of Alexander and the Persians have translated both the narrative of the exodus of the Hebrews, our fellow countrymen from Egypt, and the fame of all that had happened to them, and the conquest of the land, and the exposition of the whole law, so that it is manifest that many things have been borrowed by the aforesaid philosopher, for he's very learned. In other words, he says, there were other translations of the Hebrew Scriptures into Greek. That explains how Plato could read about it. Again, there's no evidence of this whatsoever, but that doesn't matter. As also, Pythagoras transferred many of our precepts and inserted them in his own system of doctrines. Very quickly, Pythagoras in antiquity was not just the guy responsible for this math that I hate doing. Pythagoras was an influential religious teacher and philosopher, and his doctrines were so influential, even in Platonic texts, that sometimes scholars have a difficulty separating what's Pythagorean, genuine Pythagoreanism, and Platonism. So it's very important, and he said he knew about our precepts. We must understand the voice of God, not as words spoken, but as construction of works, as Moses in the law has spoken, of the whole creation of the world as words of God. For he constantly says of each work, and God said, and it was so. Now, it seems to me that he's been very carefully followed by Pythagoras, Socrates, and Plato, who said that they heard the voice of God when they were contemplating the arrangement of the universe so accurately made and indissolubly combined by God. Now, what he means here when he says that Plato had carefully followed our legislation, he probably has in mind as part of the legislation the creation account. Because when you read Genesis 1 and then you look to Plato's Timaeus, there are quite a few similarities that were not lost on careful readers of both, like Philo of Alexandria, who in fact had a work entitled On Creation, where he basically tries to put them together. So I think that could be what he's talking about here at the end. He goes on, one last thing with Aristobulus. This is a little bit different, but it still concerns Moses because Moses revealed all this. So he says, with this it is closely connected that God, the creator of the whole world, has given us the seventh day as a rest. Because for all men life is full of troubles, which day indeed might naturally be called the first birth of light, whereby all things are beheld. Homer also and Hesiod declare what they have borrowed from our books, that it is a holy day. Hesiod, in the following words, the first, the fourth, the seventh, the holy day. And again he says, on the seventh again the sun shines bright. Homer too speaks as follows, and soon the seventh return to holy day. Now you quote Plato, and you say Plato is aware of our doctrines, and you quote Homer especially, but also Hesiod. You have now got the pillars, essentially, of Greek culture. And he's saying the pillars of Greek culture are dependent upon Moses. By the way, notice this first quotation, the text that says the first, the fourth, the seventh, that you can find that in Hesiod's Works and Days, line 770. That's in there. But the rest of the quotes are really difficult to track down. Even the Homeric quote in particular, scholars have said he just completely made this up. It's not in the original text. Maybe. It could be a lost work of Homer. I don't think we have to be that difficult. So again, how much glory does Moses have? According to Aristobulus, all Greek culture is in some sense dependent on Moses. Our last author this afternoon, Artapanus. He's otherwise unknown. In other words, he's just mentioned in the sources that preserve his text. Nowhere else do we know anything about him. Probably 3rd or 2nd century BC Egypt. By the way, if you don't know the provenance of these authors, you just say 2nd century Egypt, BC Egypt. So I think that's pretty commonplace. Perhaps Josephus has used his text as a source material for the Antiquities. If you remember, Josephus retells the biblical narrative in the first 12 or so books of the Antiquities. And then in 13, he begins picking up where the Bible leaves off. Some of those traditions seems to be, or perhaps are in Artapanus. You think what we've looked at so far is wild? Wait till you read this. Okay, so at the beginning, a couple of things I need to explain. Paul Monothes is supposed to be the name of an Egyptian pharaoh. Scholars think this is a corruption of an Egyptian name that is known. Don't worry about that. So Pharaoh had a daughter, Maris, whom he betrothed to a certain Kenephrase, king of the regions above Memphis, and she, being barren, took a child from one of the Jews and called him Moses, or Moses. But by the Greeks he was called, when grown to manhood, Museus. Museus is a figure in Greek myth. And he's often the pupil of Orpheus, who's mentioned next. This Moses, they say, was the teacher of Orpheus. Orpheus becomes known in Greek myth and Greek literature as the founder of sacred or mythic song. And later on, Orpheus becomes the source of some poetry that has eschatological elements in it, that talk about seeing God or theophany. He's saying, well, actually, Moses taught him. When grown up, he taught mankind many useful things. He was the inventor of ships, machines for laying stones, Egyptian arms, and engines for drawing water and for war. And, by the way, he invented philosophy. In other words, Moses is being depicted as the founder of all these important inventions. And we say, the inventor of ships. I mean, why would he start there? Because that's how you traveled long distances in the Eastern Mediterranean. That's it. You could say he invented transportation. And by the way, all these inventions, you can trace it in other Greek literature to other people. But what Artapanus is saying is all this is due to Moses. Further, he divided the state into 36 nomes and appointed the god to be worshipped by each nome and the sacred writing for the priests, and their gods were cats, dogs, and ibises. He also apportioned a special district for the priests. So what this is saying is Moses is responsible for splitting up the Egyptian kingdom as it is now, and he's also responsible for the religion of each of those districts. So now he's saying he's responsible for Egyptian culture. We've already seen the claim he's responsible for Greek culture. Now he's responsible for Egyptian culture, which, as we know, or as we think about, that was the oldest and most advanced civilization the world had ever seen. That's how they typically thought about it as well. Final one. For these reasons, Moses was loved by the masses, and being deemed worthy of divine honor by the priest, he was called Hermes because of his ability to interpret the divine writings. Hermes was the messenger god, but later on, Hermes also becomes the interpreter of sacred texts. And he's saying, well, actually, that's Moses. So Moses is the teacher of Orpheus, and Moses is also Hermes because of his ability to interpret the divine writings. Moses, and now he relates an event from the Exodus story. Moses stepped forward a few steps, struck the Nile with his rod, and the river flooded, inundating all of Egypt. It was from this time that the flooding from the Nile began. Not only is Moses said to be responsible for Egyptian culture, he's saying Moses is responsible for Egypt, period. Because if you recall, as Herodotus states, Egypt is the gift of the Nile, which basically means if it were not for the Nile River, there is no Egypt. Well, who's responsible for the Nile River doing what it did to create the civilization? Moses. So now finally, back to our passage. For Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses. If the author knew of traditions like we just read, and if his readership knew of traditions like we just read, how much greater is Jesus in this passage than maybe we've ever thought about? Because as great as Moses is in the Old Testament text, as I said at the beginning, he's so much greater in these other texts. So the comparison, I think, is not simply between, as impressive as it is, it's not simply between the Moses of the Old Testament and Jesus. It's the Moses of your wildest imaginations and the reality that is Jesus. How much greater is the latter than the former? Thank you.